Hello and welcome back to Predict It Live, only on Old Bull TV, your exclusive source for real-time coverage of the stock market or politics. Today, we have got your first look at the next huge market that PredictIt just launched and some thoughts on how to play today's special election in New Mexico. We've got exclusive pro trader insights and the very folks behind the only poll of this race to help us figure out how this one is going to unfold. So let's get to it. Well, traders, thank you for joining us. I am your host, Flip Pideaux. And as always, if you are new to PredictIt, we can set you up with $25 in free real cash to get started trading with. You just go to predictit.org/promo/oldbull25 for that free $25 deposit match. Now, if you are watching us live, please feel free to send in any questions or feedback in real time in the YouTube chat window. If you are not watching us live, you can follow us on Twitter at Old Bull TV, where our DMs are open. So please feel free to submit your feedback and future market coverage requests that way. Please also take just a second to subscribe to the channel while you're here. Click that little bell icon to turn on notifications so that you will be notified every time that we go live. And as you do that, travel with us to the land of enchantment, the great state of New Mexico, where today is Election Day. And today we've got three special guests joining us. They are all first-timers on PredictIt Live to help us investigate the margin of victory in the special election in New Mexico's first congressional district, the one vacated by Deb Haaland, now Secretary of the Interior. Joining us today to break this down are Joe Szymanski. He is Deputy Director of the Elections Team at Elections Daily, a must-read for election and political junkies around the country. We've also got Harrison Lavelle. He's the head of the Elections Team at Elections Daily. And joining us from PredictIt, those of you active on the message boards on predictit.org will know him as The Winner. His handle is TheWinner2875. Especially if you're following this market, it's been impossible to miss his contributions on the message board there. And he's been previewing for you that he's going to break down his strategy to play this market today on our air live. So before we get to our guests on this market, a little bit of background if you're not familiar with this district. As I mentioned, vacated by now Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. This is a safe Democratic seat. There's not really any doubt in terms of how what the outcome is going to be in terms of who's going to be elected. It's Melanie Stansbury, the Democrat, going up against Mark Moores, the Republican. They are both current state legislators, and safe to say that Melanie Stansbury is going to win. Moore, however, is making this fight a bit of a proxy battle in terms of defund the police and decarceration, some of the arguably less popular elements of the emerging potential midterm 2022 Democratic agenda. So this could be a bit of a preview of how 2022 might go in various probably more competitive battlegrounds than this one, a bit of a test run for next year. So it's going to be interesting to see, not just in terms of how this market plays out, but in terms of what this may suggest the midterms are going to hold for us. Like I said, it's an easy Dem hold. Haaland won by, I believe, about 17 points in 2020, but now it's 2021. How does it compare to just 7 months ago when Trump was on the ballot and no longer is? We've had a couple of specials, and Pennsylvania recently we were looking at the ballot amendments during their special state legislative elections and trying to compare how turnout changes with that different top of the ticket dynamic, and whether everything is still just a proxy for Trump, or if things are now more a proxy for Biden or for January 6th Commission, other stuff that's going on in Congress, or if this is more issue specific, if the defund the police kind of issue based stuff is actually going to make a dent on this race. So those are kind of all the questions. I don't have answers to any of those questions, which is why we have our guests today. So Harrison and Joe, let's start with you guys. I mentioned in the introduction that you guys were behind what I believe is the only poll of this special conducted by RRH Elections, which is, I believe, an avowedly Republican polling firm. But looking back briefly at its history, it does not seem to oversample Republicans or overestimate in these special off-year elections. In fact, some years does the opposite. It underestimates the degree to which Republicans are going to perform well. So, Harrison, I'll just start with you, if I may. Tell us a little bit about what the top lines of this poll suggest. And as traders are looking at these brackets, trying to determine anywhere from 10% to 22% or more, What does this poll kind of suggest to you in terms of what we ought to expect the margin to come out to be today?
So looking at our poll, I am pretty proud of what came out as a result, considering the fact that it was, as you mentioned, really the only poll we've seen in this race. And as you guys all know from looking at it, it was 49 to 33 percentage wise, a Stansbury lead by about 16 points. And 9% of the sample size there was undecided. And the combined third party total between Aubrey Dunn and Chris Manning was about 8%. So what you see there lines up with the fact that, as was previously mentioned, that this is a pretty Democratic district. Now President Biden did carry it by 23 points last time, and a 16-point lead for Stansbury sounds about right if you look at the district. So we did have a margin of error of about plus or minus 4% there of a 555 person sample size. So if we're looking at it, I would like to just to make sure I don't use up too much time, just quickly look at some of the other notable parts of the poll. Because a 16-point margin is reasonable, but I think it lines up better when you look at some of the other data that we saw here. So, for example, the Biden approval rating on the poll, it lined up pretty closely with the top line. Strongly approve, or voters that strongly approve of President Biden's work so far, that was actually 49%, which directly lines up with Stansbury's total. Those who strongly disapproved measured about 35%, so right around the total for Mark Moore's there. And the 58-39 overall Biden approval rating, again, very similar to his 60-37 victory in the district last year. So that's a 19-point spread there if you're looking at 58-39 there. So we're between 16 and 19. And as well, I think one last notable thing here is the gubernatorial rematch that we did between Steve Pearce and Michelle Lujan Grisham, which showed Grisham up by about, I believe, 15 points, if I remember correctly. So we're looking at a spread between 15 to 19 points. And as I can go into later, I actually ran some numbers based off of the data from the last House race here that pretty much show that even with the Republican winning Bernalillo County, which is not only the most populous county in the district, but really the make or break county in the district, but a Democratic county overall. Republicans have averaged about 40% there, but even with the Republican getting close to winning that county, about 49% of the vote, I only saw Holmes, the nominee in that district last year, getting up to 45% of the vote total, which is still a 10-point margin. So it's certainly a hard district.
So, Joe, curious to hear what your sense is based on the poll data and what you're seeing in some of the early vote data. As Harrison sort of laid out there, with the 16% gap, could see that going maybe 15 to 19%. You know, that sort of differs from what traders seem to be expecting. We've seen in the last few days, as more and more early vote data has come in, the kind of median expectation shifting from right in the middle of those brackets, which is where your poll would suggest, more towards the higher end, to the 22% or more. Is the electoral vote, the early vote that's come in thus far, and other kind of early tea leaves, giving you any sense that your polling may be off, that the margin may be significantly wider here than the expectation was a few days ago, and then your polling suggested?
You know, I think there's always that potential when you're doing special election polling. Special elections are a weird beast. They are much harder to poll than your normal regular House elections. But, there is still, we've kind of seen this before, though, that Democrats are going to overwhelmingly do well in the election day vote, but then in the early vote. But then on election day, we see Republicans do overwhelmingly better and then kind of bring that margin down a little bit. And I'm still with Harrison on that. I think we could still very much see today that if turnout is decent on election day, that Republicans bring down that margin that's much closer to our polling around, I think, somewhere in that 14 to 19% range would not surprise me at all, quite honestly. It's going to be interesting to see. There is really bad storms today happening all across New Mexico and in Albuquerque. So that could play a huge role in the turnout levels in this district. We've seen weather play roles in turnout before. It could happen again here in New Mexico, and that could lower and lessen election day turnout, which would certainly hurt Mark Moores, the Republican candidate here. And there's kind of another subject here with Moores, is that the two independent candidates that Harrison mentioned that in our poll took 8% are both right-leaning candidates. There's an independent, Aubrey Dunn, who is a Republican turned libertarian turned independent. who won a statewide race for the lands commissioner position back in 2014. And then there's Chris Manning, a libertarian, who got 3%, as we can see here on our poll. So both of those are hurting Moores, and Stansbury is kind of staying along the lines where we'd expect her to be at this point. But I do think, if I'm looking at the market itself here, I do think there's too much going on to that 22% or above. If you really want my personal opinion, I think if looking at it right now, if you put on some money on that 14.5 to 16 point range, I think there's some strong potential there to make some money when the night is done.
Yeah, if that one pays off, that's trading just now at 7 cents. So you could even pair that with a couple of the surrounding brackets, or, from what Harrison was saying, if you wanted 14.5 all the way up to 19, you can get that for in the low 20s, combining all three of those brackets. So if that looks to be the sweet spot, that might be a nice risk-weighted return available to you. I want to bring the winner here in to tell us about his trading strategy in just a second, but one more data point to think about here, just because this kind of differs state by state, is the extent to which the early voting may be largely banked and make the currently suggested margin difficult to sway. Again, I mentioned we had looked at Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, and there the market did make exactly the mistake that you're suggesting they could be making here, which is to over-rely on that early vote data. When the Pennsylvania results started to pour in right after the results closed, it was all the mail-in vote data. So the traders suddenly thought, oh, wow, this is going much more towards the Democrats. And so this partisan amendment disfavored by the Democrats would fail. Here, though, it's a little different, I think, right, where you've got the early vote data coming in on a rolling basis. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the early tabulations I had seen showed the Democrats with a much larger lead, something like 28 percentage point gap in the early vote data that's in. But how do we think about that in terms of the expected percentage of the eventual total vote that's already banked for that early voting? I mean, this is a vast majority that's already in, therefore making that 28 number hard to move, at least hard to cram down below 22, where it would be under the maximum bracket here. Can you shed any more kind of quantitative light on that, Joe or Harrison?
I would just like to add one more thing that the viewers might be interested into the statistics you were mentioning there. So I ran the numbers based off of the early vote reported in that article, and it looks like 93,106 total early votes have been reported as of, I believe, this morning when that came out. So that's about 29% of the total turnout from November. And obviously a special election, the turnout's going to be way lower than it is in November. And while I don't know for sure exactly the partisan breakdown in terms of how much of the vote has been cast in total, maybe Joe can shed more light on that, I can say that looking at the fact that what we've seen solely from early votes is already about 30% of the total votes cast from November. I think that shows us that this election could be pretty heavily early vote. And we've seen that in the two special elections that we had in Louisiana in the 2nd and 5th districts. Those were also record in terms of heavily the early vote composing the majority of the electorate. So I think it does play a role. And the weather, as Joe mentioned, could also impact our election day turnout.
Yeah, I think Harrison makes some strong points there. I do still think that, we've seen it, though, in these special elections before, though, that even though we've had record turnout in some of these special elections, more so than we've been used to seeing, because of that combination of that, not only people voting early, but then you do have voters turning out on election day. And that's kind of combined for this phenomenon where we're seeing a lot more turnout in these special elections than we're normally used to seeing. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, too, that, we're kind of in this different era right now, with the major expansion of early mail-in voting across the country. It's just very different from what we were usually used to, where it was basically just all election day voting. People get these ballots automatically now. They get more reminders about them. They're more active in voting, and I think we might be seeing another abnormally higher turnout for a special election than I think than we'd be used to seeing in past cycles.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Harrison, for that additional color on that. That's I think it'll be very useful for the people that are actually trying to crunch these numbers in real time, and we'll continue to do so tonight as the day of same day voting numbers start to come out. But without further ado, let's go to our pro trader here in the panel today. We can't see his smiling face, but the winner The winner 2875, as you from the PredictIt message boards must know him. How are you kind of handicapping this market, and where do you find opportunity in these brackets on the board right now?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm actually playing it quite safe, so I have it between 13% and 20.5%, which is around where the poll suggests, just on a bit more on each side to be extra safe. And I would say that one of the things that I feel is that the independent voters might be more likely to go for Moores than than some people might be expecting, because I know that the Albuquerque Journal wrote an endorsement of Mark Moores, that it wasn't just like their editorial board that made the endorsement, but they signed it off by saying that this was something that the Albuquerque Journal sees as their endorsement. And it's the most read news source in New Mexico. And it's also, I think I've seen that it has a bit of a slightly right partisan lean, but it's not really that extreme. And they didn't endorse anyone for president in 2020, and they often endorse both Democrats and Republicans on the state level. And in this one, in their endorsement, which is on the screen right now, they really stressed how Mark Moores is an independent voice and how bipartisan he is. I think, if I remember correctly, they mention how he says that Biden is the president and we have to work with him. And they also mention how he's good on clean energy and certain areas like that. Also, to add to that, what was said earlier was that Mark Moores is one of the main things that he's running on is crime and just overall tough on crime stance. And what we see in this article is that they also mention his stance on crime, and they mention how Stansbury supported the Breathe Act, which I think is seen as it's often lumped in with the whole defund the police thing. And I think that even though Stansbury will definitely win, and I don't think this will stop her from winning at all, I think it might mean that what some people are currently expecting to be her margin, which a lot of people seem to be saying it will be either BMax or the bracket right before BMax. I think that if we look at, for example, Deb Haaland underperformed Biden in the district in November. And often when the Democrats running for Congress underperformed the top of the ticket, it was usually said that it was because of the defund the police movement. And that's what a lot of analysis was saying. And it wasn't just the fact that there were people just not voting down ballot. There were even people who were voting for Biden and Deb Haaland's Republican opponent. So I think it is possible that there might be people who voted for Biden in November who now vote for Mark Moores, just like there were people voting for Biden's Republican opponent. I don't think that means that there's going to be any kind of a low margin. I still think the margin is going to be high, but I think it's going to be higher than what a lot of people are expecting, or lower than what a lot of people are expecting.
Right. And so that's what's been so interesting, is to see this BMax bracket creep up over the last several days as the early voting has come out. It was down in the teens, if I'm not mistaken, just a few days ago. It's currently showing up at 42%. Yeah, you can get this at 15 just less than a week ago. So you can effectively buy that it would be anywhere below 22%, the margin for 58 cents. Now we've identified a couple of different ranges here, the 14.5 to 16, or go a little wider, 13 to 19. You mentioned, I think, 13 all the way up to 22, but you can really get everything below 22 for just 58 cents. As the higher and higher that BMax goes up, I think your collective consensus, it sounds like everyone, correct me if I'm wrong, I think everyone on the panel here is expecting an eventual result below 22%. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's a pretty attractive nearly 70% return, if that's correct, that you can get presumably within a matter of hours if we know the result down to if it winds up several percentage points below 22%, then this would presumably be trading up close to 99% by the end of the day or tomorrow as the rest of these results come in. But this so often on election day turns out to be where the real money is made or lost. What should traders be expecting tonight as the results actually come out? When do polls close? Do they close at the same time across the state? Are there any specific bellwethers you're looking at geographically or in terms of, exit polls, things like that?
Well, I know for pollings will close at 9 p.m. Central Time, Eastern Time tonight. So that's when polls will close. That'll be 7 p.m. Mexico time. So 9 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, polls will close. And like Harrison mentioned, this is an Albuquerque heavy district. So Bernalillo County is really the main focus of this district here. And those will probably be the places where we see ballots drop first. So we'll have a pretty solidly decent idea of where we'll go. I don't know if we'll have any exit polling. I don't know if where we're necessarily going to get those first ballots, but I think we'll know pretty decently about an hour in where kind of the margin of this election is going.
I just have something brief I'd like to add there with some data that the traders might actually be interested in watching the stream. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit tonight with Joe on our stream. But Joe, again, mentioned some very important things, particularly with Bernalillo County, which is the bulwark of the district. This is where most of the population lives, both Republican and Democratic voters, and it will pretty much make or break the election. So just to briefly run you through some of the data, if we look at the last congressional race there, where Holland beat out Holmes by about, I believe, 17 points, as was mentioned earlier. But Bernalillo County made up 92% of the total vote cast in that election. So out of all 321,000 ballots, 91% of them came from Bernalillo. So almost certainly tonight, just to start, I would recommend that traders be watching that county all night long because, frankly, the rest of the counties in the district, Valencia, Sandoval, Santa Fe, and Torrance, have very small populations, between 1% to 4% of the total votes being cast here. And finally, just to look at some of the margins, since that's what a lot of the traders are most concerned about, Holmes, the Republican candidate, in the last election got 40.7% of the vote in Bernalillo County, which resulted in about a 17-point win for the Democrats. Now, I calculated using that margin how an improved Republican performance in Bernalillo County would affect the overall margin and created some benchmarks. So this is assuming that the other results in the smaller counties remain the same. But using the Republican data from last year, if the Republican Holmes received 45% of the vote, that would bump the Republican margin up to about 42%. But more importantly, given the fact that Bernalillo is a Democratic county, roughly 60-40, even if Holmes had in the last election gotten 49% of the total vote, so that's close to a victory, that's only 45% district-wide for a Republican, which would have put the Democratic victory margin at about 10%. So I'd like to wrap up with both things here. First off, if you look at the district from the data that I mentioned, it is obviously a Democratic district. We know that. But I'd like to back up what the winner has said and what Joe has said, in that I highly recommend to the traders that you keep it between anywhere between the 14 to 19-point margin, because ultimately it's very, very, very difficult for a Republican to bring the margin down to 10% or less, or even 10 to 15%. So I would say, again, 14 to 19% is that safe spot because, and again, I don't want to go to the other side too. I think 22% is a bit too much if we look at the polls and the evidence here, because Mark Morris could very well do a bit better than Holmes and Bernalillo. But even if we're talking Morris getting 44% in Bernalillo, unless he gets 49% or wins the county altogether, that doesn't necessarily assure that his percentage will move. So I would urge a bit of caution with it to both ends of the extreme and say to make a safe bet with this.
All right. And finally, Mr. The Winner, we know kind of where you're set up, what you're expecting the actual outcome to be here, but tell traders, tell viewers whether you have any, kind of real-time election night strategy here. Are you going to stick with what you expect to be the outcome, or are you going to look for irrational swings and overreactions within these brackets as the data start to come out?
So I live abroad, so it will be around 2 a.m. during the election. I might stay up and do something and try to, but I feel like most likely I will probably be asleep when it happens, and I'll have to just hope that what I've placed will end up being the outcome. I'd also like to add that with the poll results for Dunn and Manning, I think they added up to 8%. I think usually we see in elections when a third-party candidate earlier on in polling or even close to the election, they sometimes poll higher. Gary Johnson, for example, in the 2016 election was polling quite high throughout the election. But then as it really gets closer to the election and on the final day when people are making their decisions, the voters usually split away and end up just choosing one of the two main parties. So I think there's a good chance that a lot of the people who in this poll earlier had said they support Dunn and Manning, there's a chance that those voters will then switch and go with Morse because he's more ideologically aligned with what those voters are looking for.
Very interesting. So that could give a little bit more comfort to the sub 22 brackets, if indeed there's a somewhat more Moors friendly lean among those third parties, and I suppose among those 9% who are yet undecided. I don't know if there's any, tea leaf to be read in terms of how they would tend to break. But let's leave New Mexico for a moment and return to the new market section on PredictIt. And as I mentioned, the one of the two that they put up today is likely to be significantly raucous market within a few weeks' time. We'll have to see what the legislative calendar is like, but this is on the number of House yay votes for a January 6th committee, not a commission, but a select committee by July 30th. And viewers will know we've been covering these related markets now for a couple of weeks. Of course, the first major one they had was on the House vote on the commission from a couple weeks ago, followed by the Senate vote on the same legislation that was sent to the Senate after being passed by the House. You'll look at the brackets here. I'm not sure, do we have them up on screen? We do. Okay, most of them. You can see these are pretty similar to the brackets, the way they were tuned for the House vote on the commission. They're slightly higher. I think that one, the B min was 220 or fewer, and the B max was 245 or higher. So I believe they're the same width of 3 vote wide brackets, but a little bit higher. And you'll recall if you were following that market or that vote, that the outcome, which actually we had happily accurately predicted, was that there would be a surprising amount of bipartisan support, that you'd have more GOP votes in the House for this than the public and importantly traders were expecting. That, of course, did turn out to be the case with a final vote of 252. I've forgotten how many were on the other side, but 252 was the yay vote total, which was plenty to push you into the B max position. Again, B max here is slightly higher now with 247. A major component of the unexpectedly large support last time was the bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, which had voted to endorse the legislation by a large enough margin that per their own rules, all of the Republican and Democratic members would vote for it. Of course, not all did, but the large majority did, which was enough, even without the stragglers from kind of the GOP rank and file that hadn't made their defections public. It was likely to make it enough to get over the line into BMAX in the end. It turned out to be a very dramatic finish, but there were enough of those kind of undeclared defectors that we went well over 7 or 8 over the BMAX threshold. Again, here it's slightly higher, but the question now is, again, if it were the same vote, 252 obviously is plenty to clear that 247 threshold. The difference here, though, could be the fact that a select committee is not necessarily going to be as bipartisan or even bipartisan at all necessarily versus the more fully bipartisan commission that was voted down in the Senate. So will you have the same support, the same level of support, or could you have greater amount of support from the Republican rank and file saying, well, we've at least got to get something. We're not going to get the commission, which is what we wanted, but we've got to get something. We can't just sweep this under the rug. So I can see a case being made for B max, even a relatively easy B max here, if you get even just the same amount of support, not even any more. But I'm actually going to take a contrary view to that. Again, this one is really early. I'm just refreshing my page here. You've got only prices in B max, and then the second to B max, 244 to 246. The rest still have fairly wide bid-ask spreads of just a few pennies up into the 30s. So the market hasn't really yet figured out what it thinks about this market. I think it's actually more likely this one comes in as B min, the very bottom bracket of 222 or fewer. Again, the current partisan composition of the House is 219 Democrats, 211 Republicans with 5 vacant seats. Of course, after today, one fewer of those seats is going to be vacant, and we know it's going to be a Democrat that wins. So you're going to be at 220 is going to be that base number for Democratic held seats. So to get out, to get past the B-min, to get into that second bracket, even if all Democrats are present for and vote yes, which they well might, but obviously that's sort of the ceiling of the Democratic delegation's tally would be 220. You still need at least 3 Republicans to vote with them. So you still need some bipartisanship. I think it's possible here, given that Pelosi is likely to come back with contours for this select committee, which are not terribly bipartisan after the way it was shot down in the Senate. I wouldn't be surprised for them to come back and say, well, fine, we have a House majority. We're going to do this now on our terms. We tried to do it on common ground, on sort of consensus terms. Now we're going to do it the way we want to do it because we hold the gavels. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if you get virtually no or possibly literally no GOP votes for this. I don't think that the market doesn't really have a consensus yet, although I do just see as I'm talking, we just got a print now on B-min at 36. That's higher than I thought it might come in. Of course, we haven't had any in the last hour or so. The market's been up. I'll go so far as to say I think pairing B-min with B2, which is 223 to 225, that gives you, you can get five or six, I guess 5 GOP votes if all Democrats also vote yes. That I think that pair would likely be the odds-on favorite. In other words, that 50 or more % of the probability of how this resolves could be accounted for just in those 2 bottom brackets. And again, sometimes as we talk about this, it inspires some real-time trading. So those 2 might pop up a bit here, but I'm guessing as this settles out, people will say, nah, that's too optimistic for these bottom brackets, and that you can get into this relatively cheap. In other words, I think this is likely to come out to a very close to a party line vote, if not a precise party line vote, and that the market will likely not anticipate that, or anticipate as good a likelihood of that as I think it's fair to say that there will be. Major caveats. Obviously, we don't even have the contours of this laid out yet from Pelosi's office, and as we do, you may then start to get some response back from whether it's members of the Problem Solvers Caucus or others outside the caucus who voted for the commission last time. If a number of them start saying, yeah, this is kind of close enough, we wish it was the commission and this is going to be more partisan, but sure, I'm going to vote like I did last time. If a handful or more start saying that, B-min is dead, and maybe even the first couple of brackets are dead. So you need to be paying very close attention to this, both to Pelosi's office and then very shortly thereafter to the reaction of the GOP defectors from the commission vote. But absent any surprises from those GOP defectors, I think there's a really good chance this winds up close enough to a party line vote that B-min is my favorite, and then with a little bit of safety, you pair that with B2, possibly even B3 if you wanted. That's all exactly how you tune that combined trade would depend on sort of where these bid-ask spreads collapse to and what the pricing kind of settles down into. But as we mentioned before on this broadcast, the big opportunity here sometimes would be to get in early before the market has found its consensus. And just as an update, I'm seeing now on the page that the B-min, I should say, the 222 or fewer is really increasing here. It's now at 47 cents. And I'll remind you, this is why you want to watch this live, because as we're talking this, sometimes if we're making any kind of sense, we'll kind of move the markets. So that's my very lengthy preamble and introduction to this market. I want to invite anyone in the panel today, our mystery trader or the very well-informed folks from Elections Daily to weigh in. What's your kind of expectation here? I guess from the very first perspective versus the commission vote. Would you expect about the same, more or less GOP support? We're going to assume that virtually all Democrats will support it.
I think definitely less GOP support.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go ahead here, but I'll think personally here. I think we'll see less GOP support for sure. I mean, like you mentioned, we saw nearly 30 Republicans go for this commission last time. I think we could still see a couple people who come to mind. I think John Katko, who was behind on the Republican side for that January 6th commission, I think he is certainly someone that we could see go in here. I think we could certainly see Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania's 1st District. I could see someone like him going for that. for something like this. Peter Meyer has been very open about his calls about January 6th. So, I think, there is a slight possibility that we still do see, 2 or 3 Republicans, which might allow you then to get to that second bracket there of 222, 223 to 225. I certainly think that's a possibility. It's possible we could see, it's also, I think, about equally as likely that we see this as a partisan baseline vote. So, that's really going to be, I think, the interesting thing here. If you're looking to bet on this, I think, I think B2 would be my go-to personally. I think I would go with B2 here, that 223 to 225 here. I think that would be a smart move if I were to do something like this.
Winner, what do you think? It sounded like you had some comments here.
Yes, I would also say B2, because once we'll have 220 Democrats in the House of Representatives, all it takes is Meyer, Katko, as you said, and Cheney. And I'm not sure how Cheney, what her view will be on the fact that it's more partisan, or even someone like Kinzinger. But there is definitely, I think, enough that I think, especially those specific Republicans who take such a strong stance on it, that I think if they were willing to vote to impeach Trump, I think they would definitely be willing to do what may be seen as helping the Democrats, because as long as it actually allows them to investigate what happened in January 6th, because all of those Republicans are very strongly committed to that. And I would be quite surprised if there wasn't at least 3 Republicans voting for it, which is what it would take alongside 220 Democrats, although that doesn't take into account absences, which could also happen. Although I don't know if there will be absences for the vote.
And that's true too. You can usually count on at least 1 or 2 absences, even on a big vote, unless this comes down to become a real kind of bellwether vote where they want to make sure everyone is in town for it. But assuming you've got at least a couple, then I think you're right. About 3 is probably the number you might expect on the Republican side. Could come down to a true party line vote, but even if you get, say, 3, you get any absences and you're still stuck in B-min, which is why, again, I alluded to the possibly safer play of maybe you marry B-min with B2 here, and depending on your price, you likely are able to get in at a fairly good combined price. But those two together seem to seem to be, to me, the odds-on favorite. In other words, more than 50% of the probability wrapped up into B1 and B2. And who didn't we hear on this? Harrison, you have any thoughts in terms of? Or did you already? I'm sorry, I had my video off for a second that I lost who was weighing in. But any further thoughts in terms of the way this might play out, or sort of whose office's statements and comms offices we need to be listening most closely to get a better sense.
I agree with a lot of what Joe said. I don't have any particularly new things to add to this topic, but I did want to say that if it's possible before we end the stream, I did have a small correction because I misspoke earlier with the data on New Mexico, and I want to make sure that the viewers know completely that it's correct.
All right, guys, appreciate that. With that, I think we're up now at about 1:40. I want to take up too much of your and the viewers' time. Let me just see. I know we do have a fairly more active comment section in the chat window than we have in our most recent episodes, which I certainly appreciate. If any of y'all have questions for the panel before we let them go, please go ahead and sound it off in the chat again. Otherwise, please do feel free to follow up with us at Old Bull TV or via Twitter. You see the Twitter handles there for Joe and Harrison, Joseph Szymanski, and HW Lavelle Maps. The winner, you can find him in the PredictIt message boards, particularly on this New Mexico House special election market. I'm not with apologies, going to be able to scroll through all these comments in real time to see if there's a question on a separate market embedded here, but not seeing anything else coming up in real time. I will just again invite you to send in your comments and questions on your own time. If you have a market that we haven't yet covered, we'd be happy to do that in an upcoming episode. I want to thank you all for joining us. Joe, Harrison, and the winner himself, thank you all for being with us today and helping to break down these markets. We'll be back again 1 p.m. tomorrow. New traders, don't forget to claim that $25 free deposit match at predictit.org/promo/oldbull25. Find us on Twitter, Old Bull TV. Let us know your questions, request for market coverage. Thank you for watching. Happy trading, and we will see you next time.